Hi Taylor, this is some feedback on your paper 2 mock 1. Looking at question 1, you've got 4 marks here, so you got 4 marks for that question, so that's a good start. So if we move on to question 2, which asks you to write a summary of the differences between Eddie and Henry. Now, unfortunately, the first part of this isn't really talking about the differences between Eddie and Henry. So it's a little bit of wasted of your time there. However, moving on, you do mention 2 differences. The fact that Eddie sees his father most days, whereas Henry's not seen his dad for more than 2 years. And you've given us a good quote from Henry. And you've also mentioned the difference in the food that they eat, given us the quote that Henry's bread is nearly black. And Eddie and a pizza. Looking at the mark scheme for question 2, we look at level 2. It says attempt some inferences from one or both texts. I feel you've done that because you've mentioned the differences in the food and the frequency that they've seen their respective fathers. Select some appropriate references for textual detail. Well, again, you've done that. And the statement shows some differences between the texts. Yes, we've met that criteria. So if we move on up and look at level 3, here it says shows clear synthesis and interpretation of both texts, and the first bullet point says makes clear inferences from both texts. I feel here that to have gained the higher level marks, you needed to have done more inference, or more in-depth inference, should I say. If you had suggested that Eddie seems to have a really good relationship with his father and he can make fun of him and is quite cheeky, whereas Henry doesn't seem to have a good relationship with his father. The language used is quite cold and formal, and the fact that he's not seen him for 2 years, and Henry's father is quite suspicious of Henry's motives in writing the letter. Or you could have suggested that Eddie seems to find school easy, he doesn't have to work very hard at it, whereas Henry needs to work hard all the time and doesn't really enjoy school. With regard to the second bullet point, select clear references and textual detail relevant to the focus of the question. Whilst you have included some quotes, the fact that your inferences is a little bit lacking means that your quotes still remain at level 2. However, bullet point 3, statements show clear differences between the texts. Your statements do show this, so I think we'll give you bottom of level 3, which gives you 5 of 8, which is a good score at this point in the course. Moving on to question 3, where you asked how does Henry use language to try to influence his father. You start off quite well, where you say that he repeats to his father not to let Mr. Smith know about the letter, and you give a quote to back up your point. However, later on in your writing, you seem to resort mainly to telling the story without actually saying how he's using the language. You've not mentioned the language that's used and how it's trying to influence his father. The quotes from the text that you've chosen are really good and do show that he's trying to persuade his father or influence his father on how bad his situation is. However, you've not mentioned the terminology and you've not explained how the language used is trying to influence Henry's father. Here you've mentioned that he hopes that they may once again meet alive. You could have mentioned the fact that this is exaggeration or emotive language to try and shock his father into letting them come home. Again, here we've got a simile, like more like bears than Christians, or you could have used exaggeration. The fact that again he's trying to tell his father that they're treated more like bears, so they're mistreated. However, you do mention here he refers to his father saying, "My dear father," and you do make the good points that it shows how highly he thinks of him and is trying to persuade his dad to take his letter seriously. You could also emphasise the fact that he repeats "my dear father" several times throughout the letter, as if deliberately trying to get this point across. Going back to the mark scheme, for level 2, the first bullet point says attempts to comment on the effects of the language. Well, I think yes, you have attempted to comment on the effects of the language. Select some appropriate textual detail. Yes, you've done that, and I would even go as far to say that the textual detail that you've chosen is certainly in band 3. However, when we look at make some use of subject terminology mainly appropriately for the third bullet point, unfortunately you've not met that criteria. So although you've got some elements of level 2 and some elements of level 3, the fact that you've not used the terminology limits your work to level 1. Because of this, unfortunately, I can only give you 2 out of 12 marks. However, had you used some terminology, you could have been scoring somewhere between 6 and 9 marks for that question. Overall, you've scored 11 out of 24, which at this stage in the course, for your first attempt at the mock exam, is a decent score, and we'll be able to spend the rest of the time now working towards building up your answers to your questions and making sure that you know exactly what you're doing with them all. So well done, Taylor.